Okay, let's talk about helminths. These are cool little critters. Just as a reminder, 3 proper phyla, okay, of human helminths. It's a proper taxonomical distinction. So we've got nematodes, roundworms, they're most complex, have body cavity, so they have like a proper digestive system. And they have sexes. Nematodes. So these are flatworms that are non-segmented. Also known as flukes. They have no body cavity, and they are hermaphrodites. Now, again, to clear my conscience, there's an exception among flukes. There's one fluke that does have sexes, but remember what I told you in the very beginning of the class. We are focusing on the general rules, not on the exceptions. Okay. So for our intents and purposes, they're hermaphrodites. And the most primitive ones are cestodes. So these are segmented flatworms. No body cavity. And they are hermaphroditic as well. So let me, I really like them. I really get excited when I talk about helminths because I think they're absolutely awesome. Roundworms, I'd say the best comparison is this. Depending on the size, they can be different size, okay? But it's basically like a pencil, but with a cavity within. Nematodes, best comparison, imagine a small leaf, shape-wise. Make sense? Very, very small leaf. Cestodes, chain of small leaves, sometimes really long chain. Some specimen, I believe I saw a photograph about 40-foot long tapeworm. Yeah, it'll fit in the human intestine. It'll fit nicely.
That's nasty.
Huh?
That's nasty.
Yeah. It won't bug you.
So then what's an example of a trematode, a type of worm for a trematode?
Huh?
So like a tapeworm is a cestode.
So tapeworm is just another term for a cestode.
Right.
Nematodes, we call them flukes. Yeah. We're going to talk about all of them actually. We're going to talk about 1 cestode, 2 nematodes, and 2 nematodes. But before we get there, let's talk about drugs. Antihelminthics, okay? So there are 2 problems. They're eukaryotes, right? And we can't target reproduction. If you think about all the approaches that we take, when we take a jab at bacteria or viruses, we essentially target the replication. With these folks, we can't, because eggs is not a concern. An adult worm is the concern. So we need to kill an adult animal. Does that make sense? So there are 2 types of drugs that I can ask you about. One that I won't ask you about, but I'll mention it anyway. So, first sort of big category of drugs, bendazoles. So they're dibendazole, mebendazole, albendazole. These drugs, inhibit the formation of microtubules. When microtubules are not formed, the worm cannot move, the worm cannot grow, cells can't divide. Basically, worms become weak, lose the grip, being passed out. That make sense? Ivermectin. Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine, 2015, I want to say. A huge discovery, really. So the mechanism for ivermectin is absolutely stellar. So the drug binds to glutamate-gated chloride channels. Okay? In that statement, does that make sense? So cells in the worm have channels for chloride ions that can be opened and closed by glutamate. Turns out ivermectin can do that too. Channels open, and when channels open, chloride diffuses into the cell. And I'm not going to test your AP1 knowledge, but you may remember that when negatively charged ions diffuse into the cell, they make cell more negative, and this is called hyperpolarization. And generally speaking, hyperpolarization results in reduced nerve transmission and muscle paralysis. Does that make sense? So these two drugs I can ask you about. Interestingly, ivermectin doesn't kill the worm, a worm. It paralyzes them. This is why if you have dogs and you give them heartworm medication, you give them heartworm medication not to treat them, but to prevent the establishment of full-blown infection. They may be infected with microfilaria, dirofilaria, I don't remember the species name, but if they are on ivermectin, it makes sure that every tiny little possible worm that somewhere is paralyzed and cannot reproduce, doesn't move anywhere. Does that make sense? If they have full-blown heartworm infection, it's not going to help. Okay. Third type, again, this one, just want to mention it because I got questions sometimes. Yes, go ahead.
Why were people, like, in the start of the whole COVID pandemic, why were people trying to take ivermectin?
I will answer your question in 2 minutes. Is that okay? So, I just got students asking about Purentel.
You said this one wouldn't be in the test?
No, it wouldn't. It would not. It's depolarizing agent that basically immobilizes worms. Does that make sense? That's it. Just so these two paralyze the worms. Bendazoles result in the inhibition of microtubule synthesis. So to Julian's question, why people were taking ivermectin? Well, because some people think that doing 15 minutes Google search while sitting on the toilet is better than years of scientific studies. However, so a couple of things. First of all, to distinguish between proper study and like some crazy ass advice. It is true that both hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin showed antiviral efficacy in cells. In vitro, not even in animals, in cells, which is fine. The dosing that, if you try to translate the dose that they used in the study onto like an actual treatment, you would need to give, I listened to an interview with the scientist who worked on ivermectin, like seriously, and she said that something like 100 or 1,000 times more than people usually take for helminthic infestations, which probably won't be well tolerated. Now, multiple proper clinical studies looked at the effects of both drugs, hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. Hydroxychloroquine, nil. No effect. Actually, it makes things worse because it's known to induce arrhythmias, yes, arrhythmias in the heart. Okay, and for ivermectin, there was one study that claimed there was a huge benefit. I don't know if you've heard those news recently. It got recently busted because it looks like it was a complete fraud. Experiments were never done. People just took it like picked it from the floor. So, rifters, questions here? Make sense? Okay, let's move on to some fun helminthic discussions. So first one will be Sestoed. Echinococcus granulosus. Now this is a really interesting story because for each worm I'm going to draw a life cycle, like a very simple life cycle, okay? And every life cycle will start with eggs. Well, except for one will start it with filaria. But eggs of Echinococcus are consumed by mostly sheep. Okay? Eggs hatch in the sheep's intestine, become larvae, and larvae migrate into sheep's liver. We're good so far? Question?
The eggs go to the intestines and then
Sheeps
the
eat
larvae.
the eggs. They hatch, and larvae move to sheep's liver. Okay, we're good? Now imagine that this is the small farm, not too rich. It's not like thousands of sheep. So you have sheep, you have like horses, cows, whatever. You have dogs. Dogs, of course, are not like in-the-house dogs, like yard dogs. And you butcher a sheep to sell the meat. And what you're going to do with all the innards?
Feed them to the dogs.
Feed them to the dogs. I mean, you can throw them away, but it would be a waste, so you feed them to the dogs. So dogs will eat liver with the larva, and adult worm and the dog's intestines will release enormous amounts of eggs that will go where? On the soil, and sheep will eat those eggs, and the cycle will perpetuate and perpetuate. That makes sense? So, first of all, what's the definitive and what is the intermediate host? So, intermediate host, sheep. The definitive host, dogs. Anyone sees any humans in the cycle? No, I didn't think so either. So where do humans come into play? As one student wrote it in answer, to the say question last year, humans eat dog's poop. We don't really eat dog poop, right? But there's a contamination. So humans consume eggs accidentally, resulting in larvae hatching into the human liver. Does that make sense to you? And when larvae end up in the human liver, and we are accidental hosts, we are basically dead-end hosts. Does it make sense that we are accidental hosts? Because last time I checked, humans aren't routinely butchered and their livers aren't routinely thrown to the dogs to eat, right? So we end up with a larva in the liver, and that results in a condition known as hydatid cyst. So what is hydatid cyst? Imagine a human liver. Within that human liver, you have a bubble filled with a fluid, with larvae kind of swimming in that fluid. It can be pretty significant, but interestingly enough, it often doesn't bother a human host, okay? The problem comes if this cyst becomes ruptured. Turns out that the fluid that fills the cyst induces anaphylactic shock in humans. We don't really know the exact mechanism, but it activates that allergic response so much that people literally develop anaphylactic shock. There were cases when teens and adults who had the hydatid cyst, there were cases when people played soccer and ball hit them in the liver, cyst ruptured, they were dead in 2 minutes because nobody carries EpiPen around, and they died from anaphylactic shock. Does that make sense? Treatment is pretty simple. Well, first of all, just don't do this, and the problem solved. Just don't feed liver to the dogs. In humans, if they develop hydatid cyst, the treatment is you aspirate the fluid very carefully, wash the cyst with alcohol, aspirate alcohol, and that's it basically. Okay, that makes sense? So it's mostly in underserved and privileged areas. Now let's talk about a couple of trematodes. And what I like about helminths, when we talk about helminths, it really shows you how human behavior impacts the transmission of the disease. So two trematodes that we're going to talk about are Schistosoma and Fasciola hepatica. We're going to start with Schistosoma. There are several species. They have different geographical distribution. Schistosoma hematobium, Schistosoma mansoni. This condition is most frequently occurring in Africa and Southeast Asia. As a matter of fact, one of the first symptoms of schistosomiasis, Katayama fever, is named after Katayama Prefecture in Japan. It's just interesting fact. Schistosoma facts, everybody. So let's talk about life cycle. It's all going to be based on life cycle. As usual, we start with eggs. Eggs in the soil, eggs in the water, basically from the fecal matter. They get consumed and hatch into larvae in the snail. So snail in this case will be intermediate host right away. Now snails release larvae in the water. Are you with me so far? And here's an interesting thing happens. People swim in the water, bath or wade, whatever. So I'm going to put via intact unbroken skin. And we'll get back to this, how it penetrates. So via intact unbroken skin, I left myself enough space and for some reason started to use that in the bottom. Adult worms populate capillary plexuses around the gut and urinary bladder. Does that make sense? We good so far? Okay. So now check this out. So first of all, we're gonna completely skip this part. Like this is not so interesting, snails, whatever. So let's start from this point. Larvae in the water. So jump in the water, swim around. Say we're in Africa, okay, and it's really hot, and we just go basically skinny dipping, and then we get out, and there's no towel. It's hot, so it's okay. So we dry. Right? The only problem is when we dry, due to the surface tension and evaporation of water, skin gets kind of tighter. You know that feeling when when water dries on you. It's like tension on the skin. So it opens up a little bit hair follicles, and larvae get into the hair follicle and through the hair follicle into the bloodstream. Okay, and they end up in the capillary plexuses where they develop into an adult worm. Capillary plexuses around the gut, so basically your enterohepatic circulation, and around the urinary bladder. So gut-associated problems Some diarrhea, possibly. Mostly blood-related disorders, so people can develop portal hypertension, liver problems, pulmonary hypertension. In systemic schistosomiasis, people can develop CNS infection. But in my opinion, the bladder-associated worms are much more exciting. Here's what happens. Worms will cause an inflammation of a bladder, urinary bladder. That makes sense. Because, immune system will respond and stuff. How do we call an inflammation of a urinary bladder? Cystitis. So it's going to be chronic cystitis. And we know pretty well that chronic inflammation often leads to cancer. One of the sort of long-term possible outcomes of chronic schistosomiasis is urinary bladder cancer. Does that make sense? So I couple of things to kind of color it a little bit. First, I listened to a clinical presentation of a really interesting case. A guy who worked as a missionary volunteered with the church in Africa. He was baptizing locals, and he was standing in the water, waist deep. So he comes back to the States, develops fever, Karayama fever, and rash. It's one of the first signs. And he develops rash right where he was in water. Not above, just where, because he walked out and, dried out. So right where schistosoma was entering, that's the rash, below the waist. Okay? Second interesting thing. Now this is not an urban legend, but it's more like personal communication. Heard in an interview. In Egyptian historical documents, ancient Egyptian historical documents, scientists found mentions of male menses, male menstruation, and they were kind of puzzled until parasitologists came along and said, well, that's probably schistosomiasis. Nile River, all those ponds and lakes, kids were probably swimming in them, contracted schistosomiasis. Over time, it went all the way to the bladder. They developed cystitis, and about at the teenager age, they started one of the symptoms of cystitis being blood. They started being blood, and they said, "Oh, the boy comes out of age. How cool!" So they didn't know. Questions here. So if you're in Africa, just carry the towel. Just in general, it's a good advice. If you read Hitchhiker's Guide to Galaxy by Douglas Adams, you know that towel is the most important. Another trematode, Fasciola hepatica. Now, I'm going to put the life cycle next, and definitive host, obviously, humans. So definitive host is a human. The life cycle of Fasciola hepatica is somewhat similar. Also starts with eggs being consumed by snails, and then those snails release larvae in the water. But this time, larva has to be eaten. We use this water for irrigation of various plants. So larvae end up on the plants. Does that make sense so far? Good? And then these plants are being eaten by cows, or sheep, if it's some kind of a meadow, or if it's a plant that's like a salad, like watercress salad, humans. Does that make sense to you? So instead of going through the skin, we just eat them. What happens to those larvae as they develop in adult worms? They end up in the intestines, obviously, but then from intestines, they crawl backwards through the bile duct. They live in the bile system. Does that make sense to you so far? So, bile ducts. Okay, now, we have two organs that deal with either production or storage of the bile. Gallbladder and liver. Does that make sense? So if you crawl through the common bile duct, you will be at the fork. If you go, I have a really vivid imagination, if you go left, you end up in the gallbladder, and if you go straight, you will end up in the liver. So those who go straight end up in the small bile ducts in the liver. Obviously, they will block them. They can destroy liver tissue, so people will develop jaundice, hepatomegaly, malabsorption of fats, diarrhea, malnourishment, all that kind of stuff. That makes sense. Some of them will take a path to the gallbladder. And here's an interesting thing happens. Listen. These worms, why bile ducts? Turns out, worms feed on epithelium in the bile ducts. Okay, so this is a really cool mechanism that I want you to know. They feed on epithelium in the bile ducts. But epithelium grows not as fast as worms would want. So what they do, worms produce mitogen, a chemical that stimulates the division of epithelial cells. They're basically little farmers that fertilize your epithelium, making it grow faster. So far, so good?
What do they produce?
It's called mitogen. I'm going to put the word here. Mitogen is any chemical that stimulates cell division. So they stimulate cell division in the epithelium. Does that make sense? When your cells divide faster than they should, they eventually develop what type of phenotype? What happens to them? They become cancerous. Does that make sense? And it is well known that fasciolosis, chronic fasciolosis, it's called the sheep liver fluke, like common name. Common fasciolosis may result in a gallbladder cancer. Does that make sense? Like the whole mechanism with epithelium. You got it?
But not liver cancer.
Not, interestingly, no, not liver cancer. Specifically because probably they don't probably just get stuck in bile ducts in the liver. They can damage liver, absolutely, but specifically gallbladder cancer. And it's interesting because if you eliminate disease in a definitive host, you break down the transmission, right? So basically, if you hypothetically can treat every person, every human, from schistosomiasis, you can break down the transmission, but you can't do it here because you can treat humans, but what about cows and sheep? Again, this is also personal communication. Iceland did, if you look at the map of distribution of Fasciola hepatica in the world, Iceland is clean. They did the most Viking thing one can imagine. They had a recurrent problem. They have a lot of sheep there, and sheep were carrying Fasciola hepatica and it was going to humans. So what they did, they decided, and they butchered all the sheep, all of them. I think it's the most Viking thing to do, like killed all of them, treated the entire population of the country to rid of worms, so people don't pass, and then bring clean sheep in. And that's it. It's clean. There's no Fasciola hepatica there. Only because it's an island, so there's no sort of migration or anything that worked. But killing all the sheep, that takes some days. And finally, two nematodes. So we've got, first one is Ascarious Lubricoides, which has a very, very interesting life cycle. Again, we're going to start with eggs.
Are these epithelial
No. Those are nematodes. Those are helminths. Those are just nematodes, roundworms, okay? So eggs. Eggs are consumed by the humans, right? And they hatch into the larva in the gut. Are you with me so far? It's going to be a really interesting trip here. So larvae go from the gut, they're really small, they go from the gut into the bloodstream. Do you have bacteria in the gut? It's kind of a dumb question. You do. So those larvae, when they crawl into the blood vessels, they take some bacteria with them. Am I clear? First symptom of Ascarious Lubricoides infestation is gram-negative bacteremia and fever. Okay. Speaking of, well, we'll get to the adult one. So blood brings larvae into the lungs. Now, when something fairly small but kind of irritating is in your lungs, what you going to do with that? Cough it out. It's the second symptom. People start coughing. And they cough it up and up and up, and all this larvae within the mucus, they're really small. They get all the way up to your larynx. Does that make sense? What you normally do with the mucus that goes up from your lungs and bronchi and trachea? No. Normally. Yeah, you swallow it. You constantly swallow mucus. That's the way to get rid of the crap that's in the mucus. You swallow it, it goes into the stomach, acid kills everything, right? So larvae, after being coughed up, go back in the gut. Second time. And now they develop into an adult worm. You good so far? So, was there any animal mentioned? No. So, humans are definitive hosts and intermediate hosts at the same time. Okay?
Where do they get the eggs from?
Adult worms, we'll get there, but here's one very simple, kind of tongue-in-cheek tricky question. If you have an adult worm, one adult worm in the gut, will it produce eggs?
Yes.
What did you say first? No? Yes? If you have one person, can one person give birth? No. You need two people of opposite sex, right? And there's only female. So, even if you have a female in the gut, unless there is a male, it can't produce eggs. So you need two worms of opposite sex. When that happens, female can churn out up to 100,000 eggs a day. Okay? And eggs pass in feces, end up. So where do feces end up? If you live in a building that has a toilet, and if you don't live in such building, in the soil, in many places, especially poor places, folks use what's called night soil, basically human feces, as a fertilizer. It works great, but the problem is those eggs will end up in the soil and the plants, and they will eat them back again, and the cycle will perpetuate. So that's one thing. The simplest way to get rid of this is to supply people with fertilizer. Tell them, stop using this, use chemical fertilizer, whatever, manure, I don't know. But don't use human waste. That makes sense. If you're curious, like when we say underprivileged, there was a study a couple of years ago that looked on the prevalence of ascariasis in the United States. Rural areas of Alabama showed about 70% prevalence. If people don't have flushable toilet, they have like poor outhouse. If the waste doesn't get buried deep enough, and deep enough is about 6 feet, capillary forces can push the eggs out, and they will end up in the environment. That makes sense? So it's unacceptable, really. Now, what about disease? So these are the largest human nematodes, about this big. Okay. If you have a couple of those, it's not a big deal. But first of all, reinfection can happen. So people can get more and more eggs. Does that make sense? And that will lead to the accumulation of worms in the gut. There were cases reported with 2 to 3 pounds of worms in the gut. That results, even if you treat, it's very treatable. Albendazole will do it. But even if you treat it, intestinal blockage, and that's it. You have to cut out the intestines. Well, not the whole thing, but just the worms out of them. Makes sense, right? And if you have so many worms in the gut, malnutrition, diarrhea, bloating, liver problems, jaundice, all that kind of stuff. That makes sense? One of the most common nematodes in humans, huge problem. It's actually a big sort of type of helminths called soil helminths, because many of these infections are associated with the soil transmission. Last nematode that we're going to mention is Strongyloides stercoralis. So it has a bit of a complicated life cycle. So what we've got, infection, human infection starts not with an egg, with a larva. So larva that resides in the soil can penetrate intact skin and get under the skin. Resulting in the condition known as cutaneous larva migrans, CLM. I have pictures in the notes showing it looks like a rash, but imagine that your rash is moving. It's not moving fast. Don't worry, it's not moving fast. It's just, but you look at the picture, like let's say you look at the rash, which on the hand it's probably going to be very unlikely. But let's say you have it on the hand, right? On the arm. So you look at the pattern. An hour later, you look at the pattern, it changes because the larvae crawl under the skin. Larvae end up in the circulation, develop into adult worms in the gut. That make sense? So these adult worms plus eggs. And here's an interesting thing happens. This is the only worm that we know. Strongyloides stercoralis is the only worm that causes human disease that also can reproduce without a human. So it's not an obligate parasite. Does that make sense? So eggs can develop into larvae, but the larva can develop into adult worms in the soil. So kind of, human is nice, but not required. That part, does it make sense? So once eggs are in the soil, it's fine. The worm can persist in the soil for a really long time. This infection is mostly associated with tropical climate, pretty common in people who work in the field. For instance, in Southeast Asia, people who work in the rice fields, when they work, there's water on the rice field, they will probably walk with their bare feet, and the worm will just penetrate through the skin on the feet. Make sense? It will establish the infection, the intestinal infection is mildly symptomatic, not really too symptomatic. Am I clear? Here comes the problem. When people who have chronic sort of mild strongyloidiasis, become immunosuppressed. Okay. Eggs will be able to hatch in the gut, produce more larvae in the gut, produce more adults in the gut, and that will result in what's called systemic strongyloidiasis. So this process right here happens in immunocompromised. Yes,
Did you mean to put that in the middle one?
can't hear you.
Did you mean to put that in the middle one? With the, like under the strongyloids? Did you mean to put that?
Oh yeah, I put it in the wrong one, sorry. Yeah, sorry, mixed up, appreciate that. Yeah, it was something wrong here. So yeah, adult worm will produce eggs, which hatch in the larva. So more worms, thank you very much. Okay, does that make sense?
That's called systemic.
And that will result, there's so many worms that it will start spreading. Okay? So this happens, thank you. Huh?
That's the superinfection?
Superinfection, yeah. Immunocompromised, immunosuppressed. Now, you may, here's an interesting thing. So what I tell, oh, maybe it sounds so artificial, but as a matter of fact, there's pretty much a cohort of people that you can see this condition in. So strongyloides is not common in the United States, basically, but it's very common in Central and South America. So people emigrate to the United States, and often, sometimes they bring their parents with them, older parents, and they may develop conditions that require immunosuppressive treatment, like rheumatoid arthritis or something. And there's more than one case, like there are systemically cases when a woman who recently arrived from, I don't know, Bolivia or Ecuador would get treated, or a man, it doesn't matter, woman, man, I just remember one particular case, but they would get treated with prednisone for some inflammatory condition that will suppress the immune system, and they will develop superinfection because they were chronically infected with strongyloides. Nobody tests for this. Does that make sense? It's treatable. Don't get me wrong. It's all treatable. Even superinfection is treatable. You just have to diagnose it properly. Questions? This is what I find absolutely fascinating about Helminths. Two things. Geography plays an immense role. Like, you ask people, did you go there? Where did you come from? And social behavior contributes to the transmission of the disease in many cases. Like the story with fasciole hepatic, or the story with Echinococcus granulosus. It's all about social behavior. That make sense? Okay.